I was watching your channel since it first started, and then I've been reading some of your blogs as well. The topics you've been focusing on, Ebionites, origins of Christianity, James, Jesus, Paul. Your channel is pulling the thread, tracing Jesus beyond Christianity. I noticed with an X too. And I watched your journey from Messianic Judaism to authentic Judaism. Actually, I saw your other one, which was from Christianity to Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it that, to summarize, what was it that made you leave Christianity for Judaism?
I mean, it was a process, of course, for sure. Lifetime of exploration. I'd say Judaism is a personal, moral, ethical decision for myself that aligns with my values. Personally, I went to a more philosophical, history, science-based branch of Judaism. I don't know if you know the different branches, but conservative Judaism, we embrace things like the document hypothesis, and we look at even, the Tanakh, the Torah, with a historical critical lens, and that informs our decision. So we don't look at the Torah as the more orthodox inclined would say it's, if you're using Christian terms, the infallible word of God.
You're not taking it literally. It's metaphors and symbolism, right?
More that it's a historical document of the people of Israel, and that it holds the traditions and the self-thought they had of themselves, of the time. Now, if you want to look at like any historical text from the time period, you got to look at it in the lens of the way news is covered these days, because the text that we have that became holy text really was their way of recording, a newspaper. They didn't have the idea of a newspaper, but they're recording their self-thought of how they see the world, how they interact with other people. And so if you look at it through the lens of I'm reading a newspaper, whereas instead of at this point, we've moved forward in time where we understand science and history, and the things that we can't control, we can explain through science. At the time when you can understand why I, as a good person, deals with difficulties and conflict and things that are outside of my control, there must be a higher power causing and influencing these things. So it's a blend of, history, but then it's also, of course, myth making, because for us within, you would call it the secular Jewish tradition, or at least the conservative Jewish, we see Moses and Abraham as legendary accounts of what was most likely historical people, but it's legendary accounts. It's not historical factual. There's historical fact mixed in with myth making. All cultures do this. You go back to Greek and Roman culture.
Foundational myths, kind of like Plato's noble lie.
Yeah. Romulus, the founder of, the Roman Empire, and the myth making that goes around, who may have been a historical person, but then they're deified and there's all this embellishment added to it. Whereas there may have actually been a person these stories are based upon. Just what we have in accepted text may not be 100% factual. There's a lot of myth and legend in it. So, as a person, let me circle back to answer your question. As a person who has always gravitated towards rational, reasoning, sounded things, for me, the choice of going to conservative Judaism fit because it fit with my, value system, my morality, and the way that I look at the world. And I like to look at things with a critical lens. So I don't want to be in anything where I can't critically look at things. So,
you used to be, it's been a while since I watched your testimony video, but you used to be Jehovah's Witness, right?
So, yeah, my mom converted to Jehovah's Witness kind of due to trauma, but early on when I was like 4 or 5 years old, my father was not an adherent. His parents came from a Catholic background, but he wasn't an adherent. But my mom kind of forced her way upon us, and my father allowed it. So I was raised with a lot of the Jehovah's Witness, very cultic mindset. You don't question the truth. Of course, they call what they do the truth, but it's an unfounded claim. So
you kind of went from believing that, Jehovah's Witness don't believe in the Trinity. They're Unitarian, but you went from believing Jesus is the Messiah to believing Jesus is not the Messiah. How did that happen?
I mean, there's a lot of steps in there, but one, textually, the Jehovah's Witnesses base their claims upon the Greek New Testament. So going with the Greek New Testament before getting historical critical in it, really there's not a support for Unitarianism within the Greek New Testament if you look at it from the received text we have. Now, when you get into textual criticism, undermines the whole thing in many ways. But in my studies at the time, as I was trying to understand these ancient texts, going from this group says this, but the original text says this, with the text I was looking at, the Trinity made more sense basing some of my values, because my values were more inclined towards the Tanakh at the time anyways. But
what about like the prophecy fulfillment of Jesus? Like, did you used to think he fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament and then now you don't anymore?
I don't know if I ever, of course I heard that and probably propagated it at some point.
Like I've seen you had Tovia Singer on, like he's about debunking that Jesus fulfilled prophecies. Right. So was Tovia part of your conversion to Judaism?
His teachings definitely, I want to say conversion to Judaism, but in the information melee of information I took in, because I was taking in Bart Ehrman, James Tabor, Chaim Maccabee,
Eisenman.
Eisenman, I mean, very influential in the way I think. And then when it comes to like Jewish thought on these things, yes, Tovia Singer, he was influential. But no, he didn't play a role in my personal decision to convert to Judaism. That was more a personal morality choice.
Was there any thought of maybe going to Noahidism? Because I've heard a lot of, there's proponents, people leave Christianity and they become don't convert to Judaism, but become Noahides and follow the 7 laws of Noah.
So to get to where you're going, there's kind of a journey. And it's a historical critical journey, and it's a textual study to get there. I want to answer your one question first. Did I superimpose Jesus as Messiah into the Tanakh? Now, I never really explored it, and I always had problem with theological statements. One of my big issues when I did convert to Christianity, was involved in the Assemblies of God, was their theological statement. They tried to cram in and do eyes of Jesus into the Tanakh and the New Testament, and they're just hopping around like gazelles trying to find scriptures, on the mountaintops of text to say, well, this means this means that. And so I never fully bought into the theological statements because I always questioned the legitimacy of, like, even in the context. It doesn't always mean what they say it mean. But
at one point you believe Jesus like fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament, and then so now you don't think that a person ever actually did these things? You think that like the Gospels is myth, mostly myth?
I mean, yes, there's a lot of myth making. So there was a period of time though when I was going from Christianity and Messianic Judaism that I bought the Kool-Aid, and they were trying to put Jesus in all the festivals and all this kind of random stuff. A bit of it felt like cloth that didn't fit.
Wait, hold on. Wait, what do you mean Jews are trying to put Jesus in festivals? What do you mean by that?
Messianic Jews, not Jews.
Michael Brown. I've talked to Michael Brown a few times.
Okay, yes. Yeah. So Messianic Jews, which I'd clarify to say they're Christian, Hebraic Christians, but not authentic Jews. They're Jews in the sense that Hellenistic Jews were Jews. They were culturally Jewish, but they didn't adhere to the tenets of Judaism. They adhere more to Christianity. But people who claim to be Jews were saying, Jesus fulfills these things, which I always found odd because I had read the Tanakh a few times as a child and honestly didn't see the connection. I didn't feel a full connection, but at the time I kind of just bought into the Kool-Aid of the soup that was going on.
Not even with Isaiah 53, because like the New Testament quotes Isaiah 53 like verbatim.
I mean, it's from the Greek Septuagint, and it seems it's written to the Jewish people, not to an individual. It's if you read,
well, that's the original context. But if you look at what Paul and the Christianity says, they don't care about the original context.
Well, and
It's like
that's
everything's
the
all of
problem.
the sacred scriptures are like a mystery where like they can, connect the right verses and like reveal hidden secrets from God and stuff. Like that's my understanding of what they were doing. I mean that's what the New Testament looks like.
Yes, and to speak to that, really, so the ideas of Merkaba mysticism, the blending with Platonic thought, came from Hellenistic Judaism that goes back to the Maccabean period, which goes back to when Ptolemy commissioned the Greek Septuagint, and so kind of, I don't know if we're going to get into this idea, but the New Testament is really a Roman psyop. It's a psychological operation to overtake and subdue a people and then convince them to follow the Roman way. They would co-opt religions throughout, the Middle East, Mithraism, and they would try to blend them with their own Roman ideas. So one of the ways you conquer a culture is you take their text and you rewrite it, but you give it your flavor, and then you tell them that your way is the only way. So when they rewrote the Greek Septuagint, there's changes in the Greek Septuagint from the original Hebrew. It influenced these subtle changes. Now, the texts that form a basis of the Christian myth come from the Apocrypha, the texts that aren't accepted in the normative Judaism, where the Chumash, the first 5 books, are the foundation, and then you have the prophets and the Ketuvim, the writings. Those were not as central. Now, the Apocrypha, this includes Tobit and Jubilees and the Enochian literature and
Wisdom of Solomon
Wisdom of Solomon. And a lot of that is where the
and Songs of
mysticism.
Solomon. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and a lot of that is found in the Greek Septuagint,
Mhm.
and it was promoted by Hellenistic Jews, who did not adhere to Torah Judaism. They weren't observant. They blended more with Roman culture. They wanted to go to the bathhouses. They wanted to go to the amphitheaters and coliseums. They didn't. They weren't so.
They were the Alexandrian Jews like Philo who was like reading the Torah mystically and trying to kind of blend it with Hellenistic thought. And
Yes.
have you heard the idea that the Nazarenes are the predecessors to the Ebionites and that they split at one point and had some association with Alexandria? And the Talmud says that there was a temple in Alexandria, a huge diaspora there.
So I would invert that. I would say the Ebionites are the forerunners and the Nazarenes are an offshoot. And there are a few authors that hold that idea.
I've heard it
Now,
both ways too.
there is debate about that. So the Nazarenes went more to the Hellenistic idea when they embraced the Pauline literature and the Platonic philosophical traditions, and they became more Gnostic. And really, the Pauline literature, the Gnosticism, the Merkaba mysticism, led them on a path. Of course, because they weren't temple centric.
They were anti-temple and anti-temple sacrifices.
Yes. And so that was, I say, for me, when I'm studying the historical literature, the parting of ways between the Nazarenes and Ebionites, who remained in synagogues, which we have records up to the 8th century, and then the Nazarenes, they became the foundation of Christianity. It's why to this day, within Talmudic literature, they refer to Christians as Nazarenes, because and essentially, Nazarenes went the way of Hellenistic Judaism, which was blend. And the reason it played so well is because when you play into the mysticism that came from Egypt, right? Ptolemy's in Egypt. Yes, there was a Contra temple in Egypt, and they blended Egyptian ideas. Definitely with the mysticism. It was intriguing. Here's the thing that was intriguing to the Romans. Because if you look at the pantheon, the gods had immorality, sex, backstabbing. There wasn't a moral God who gave a moral ethical value system. And so philosophers within the Platonic tradition started going towards henotheism, the idea of one God with an ethical system. And there was influences from some of those who had read the Greek Septuagint. So Hellenism was kind of a blending of those ideas that started with the Greek Septuagint and, the Roman conquest. And what really I feel like wasn't it, the Greek Septuagint was a method to assimilate and start to indoctrinate um, Jews away from a temple-centric cult. And here's what made it, the dying and rising gods, the mysticism, the Watchers, and like even in the Enochian literature where you're looking for this higher power. This is where when we come to Christianity, it's easier to hypothesize Jesus himself and turn him into a dying and rising God. Because the Hellenism already laid the foundation for that. And I don't know if I'm getting too far off course here, but
well, yeah, let me back you up on it because I got a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So you have an article here about Paul as a mystic, right? There's the verse, he's caught up into the third heaven, into paradise. And I've got a really good book here, Kabbalah by Gershom Scholem. He talks about how the Essenes basically branched out of them is kind of like what looks like Christianity and what looks like Merkava mysticism, and then later into Kabbalah, right? So like mystical. And then you look at Daniel Boyarin, the Talmudic scholar from Berkeley. He talks about how they were reading scripture, like trying to find divine mysteries midrashically. Like we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're connecting all these different messianic motifs, like in the Melchizedek scroll. It's saying like this is the divine, judgment, redeemer, Melchizedek, the high priest, and then they're citing like Psalms and Isaiah and Daniel to like describe, kind of write a story about what they thought the redemption would look like. So I think Paul was a mystic, and I think he clearly says like he never knew Jesus, right? He saw him in the scriptures from Revelations when he's caught up into paradise, and I think that. Also, James and Peter and the first Christians before him were also seeing Jesus mystically in the scriptures. And
okay,
hold on, let's just add one more caveat to that.
Finish your thought.
And one of the reasons is because Epiphanius talks about the Ebionites, and he says that James was very devout, right? He was like going in the temple. He's ascetics, right? He wasn't eating meat. Doing the ritual bathing, all these things. He was very devout, and he was the leader of the first Christian sect. But Epiphanius talks about a book called The Ascents of James. So I just see Paul as like ascension, mystical, midrashic story. He says, have I not also seen the Lord? Like he saw him the same way they did. Paul says, I learned nothing from them, nothing more of the gospel from them. He doesn't even really treat them as if they really knew Jesus. So also the ascent of James and then the ascension of Isaiah. And then you look at Hebrews, it's like Jesus ascending in the heavens. He's the heavenly high priest. No mention of like an earthly figure at all. So I am a mythicist, and I think that Paul was a mystic, and they were all kind of mystical, related to the Essenes. So what do you think of that?
Well, so I think you're conflating two different branches of mysticism into one. So the Enochian Judaism or Hellenistic Judaism that came through the Hellenistic culture, I think sometimes gets conflated with Essene mysticism.
Well, Enoch. Hold on, Enoch was found at Qumran, though. Everything but the similitudes was found there.
So I want to make a definition between the two.
Okay.
They pull from some of the same texts, but they are different in application and practice. So Enochian Judaism and Essene Judaism, and Enochian Judaism is a modern term. So, you could throw the term out, just like Essene is like our best guess of what they called themselves. So let me define the two branches of mysticism that pulled from the same text but came to different conclusions. The Hellenistic, what I'll call Enochian Judaism, was not a temple cult they weren't focused on kashrut and festivals. They blended with secular culture, and they liked the myths that, played very well within the philosophical elite in Roman culture, that they liked the groundedness of henotheism and the ethics of Torah, but at the same time, the Greek culture still believed in a pantheon. Now, when we move into the Essene mysticism, I would say that Paul in the New Testament is contra Essene, and it is more Enochian Judaism than it is Essene. And there's two branches of mysticism there. One, the purity rituals of the Essenes, the ritual purity, they didn't believe the temple was pure, but if there was a pure temple, they'd worship there. They didn't believe in practicing in the temple in Jerusalem because that was corrupt. They felt the Sadducees were corrupt, but they believed in temple sacrifices, but they wouldn't participate because the temple was corrupt. And so they would ritually purify themselves. They didn't, eat meat, and they wouldn't defecate on the Shabbat, and they observed Shabbat in the festivals. Whereas Enochian Judaism participated in secular culture and myth in a way that, so the two different branches, and I think it also can be illustrated in the way that the Ebionites stayed more within Jewish tradition and the Nazarenes went more with the Roman tradition. I think that there needs to be a distinction between the two types of mysticism to understand the distinction that one led it to the parting of ways, and that one was more secular, and the ascetic of James is different than that of Paul. Now, Paul did say he spent 3 years in the wilderness, just like Josephus said he spent 3 years in the wilderness with Essenes and studying that way of life. But I think a majority of the New Testament written, at least the Pauline literature and the stuff written by him, can be seen as contra Essene, and embracing fully the Hellenism of Platonic thought. And now, Essenes and the Hellenistic Judaism were not mainstream Torah temple-centric Judaism, because the Essenes opted out and Christianity became something separate. So, when
preparing the way in the wilderness.
Yeah, yes. And when you talk about the Pharisees, they became what's rabbinic Judaism. So we're talking of three different branches of Judaism. Essenes disappeared because of their ascetic way of life. And we just have echoes of their writings, and then the findings at Qumran. Now, Pauline really is the Hellenistic Judaism that was part of the early Roman psyop when they translated the Greek Septuagint and sought to influence.
How could it be a Roman psyop when there was the Greeks that translated it?
Well, yes, right. Okay, so.
And just by the way, I totally disagree that it's a Roman psyop. I think Paul was he thought he was chosen in the womb. He was scouring the books. He was convinced in this cosmic suffering Messiah figure, and he thought he was chosen in the womb to be the nation, to the prophet to the nations, so the apostle to the Gentiles. And I feel like it says in Acts how James and the Jerusalem church told him, like, yes, we agree, go to the Gentiles, get them to follow these laws, bring them to the God of Israel. I see Paul and Christianity fulfilling all the prophecies of the Old Testament, where it's about like the Moshiach going to the nations. Like in Isaiah, it says they will put, he will be the light to the nations. They will put their hope in him. He will raise a banner to the nations. Like you could see the Midrash from Paul, actually, where he cites the verses that the Jews are supposed to reject this Messiah, and then the Gentiles are supposed to go to him. Like, I see it as a religion for the Gentiles. It's so anti-Jewish and pro-Roman. It's to appeal to the Romans so that...
that makes my point right there. But I'm going to go back. Now, thank you for catching my...
Greek and Roman.
Yes, yeah. Greco-Roman should have been the term I used. The Greco-Roman psyop. It started with the Greeks with Ptolemy. And it continued with the Roman occupation. So thank you for catching my foible on that. But the Greek Septuagint was, commissioned by Ptolemy, and there were changes to the text, and there's differences between the Greek and the Hebrew. And it's why, Jews to this day read in Hebrew, because to translate is to lie, because you can influence people through translation. And so there was an intentional change to the text, and it does breed into Hellenistic Judaism. Fast forward, because that's the period of the Maccabees, to the first century. Now, the co-opting, did Paul exist? I mean, does the Paul of the New Testament exist? Like the question, who is Paul? I think Paul is that we have of the New Testament is amalgamation of maybe Simon Magus.
The spouter of lies from the Dead Sea Scrolls is what Eisenman thinks.
Yes. So he's an amalgamation of things. The literature found by Marcion, most likely written or at minimum redacted by Marcion, which became further redacted when the Proto-Orthodox co-opted and then wanted to change it because they didn't like Marcion's ideas, which became the founding for the writing of the New Testament, which became the New Testament. But who was Paul? You know, I mean, it's possible that some of his story was embellished from the story of Josephus because they both spent 3 years in the wilderness and share the same philosophical underpinnings. So, I mean, the New Testament, it's hard to take any part of it part and parcel because you have so many layers of redaction. And this is why when I'm talking about like Greco-Roman psyop, that it was over time that they influenced the translation and the transmission of the text to their purpose and end. And it was a process, and it was the process of Hellenization, which is the secularization of the culture they're trying to take over. Now, the great thing about it is because it became popular. The ideas of henotheism and ethics, it started spreading to other people, and they saw the power of it to influence others. There's so many layers that many like centuries that they were doing this redaction. By the 4th to the 8th century, they became very effective using it, and they changed it for their own purposes. Now, does that mean there wasn't an original like Paul that had some ideas, or Jesus? They definitely if they were different than what's passed in the New Testament that we have. And so uncovering and understanding who Paul was, I would put Paul definitely more within the Hellenistic tradition, and a lot of the miss, I would say, was later redaction, putting into the text to try to put it in a picture that made more sense. But the blending of the Messiah myth with the apotheosis, the turning a dead Caesar into God, was really the foundation of the creation of the Jesus of the New Testament, which I don't believe he lived, but there was probably a Jesus who died, but he didn't fulfill prophecy. And from what I understand from reading the text, that there is a group of early Ebionites that thought he was a prophet calling for the end of temple sacrifice, who may have wanted to be
Paul, right?
No, Jesus.
Oh,
Jesus was a prophet calling for the end of temple sacrifice, and he wanted to be king, and that is what got him cut off. That's who I see the historical Jesus as.
And then you think his followers like started searching the scriptures to try to justify that the Messiah was supposed to suffer? So after the fact?
We have two major events that make it hard to piece that together. One is the battle at Masada that led to the battle that's leading to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, where they came in and the Romans took over and they burned the temple, destroyed the records we would have. We don't have text from that period because they destroyed everything. And then
it later popped up in the Talmud, likely too.
Well, yeah, stories would have been passed down, but there's going to be oral traditions that are passed down, yes, but the text that would have been then would have been destroyed. And again, the Bar Kokhba revolt, two instances where they went in and took over and would have destroyed buildings, structures, and history. So we don't have the important documents from that period. Now, luckily, we do have documents that survived in Qumran of the Essenes, but they weren't central to Jerusalem. They were an ascetic group outside. So what we don't have a really good picture of, and this is what we have to piece together, is what happened before 70 and what happened before 133. Now we have oral traditions within the Talmud, and we have the church fathers' sayings. But again, just like the story of Jesus, these are decades and centuries after the original story. So we don't have a perfect picture, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so piecing it together, it becomes challenging, and then a lot of it's polemical. So you can't take it at face value. How do you find the intrinsic historical value with the polemic? Mm-hmm. It's challenging.
So you said you've also read Jewish Gospels by Daniel Boyarin?
Yeah, it's been a while, but yeah.
And he talks about how Christianity is like a perfect midrash. He says it's a midrash on Daniel 7 and 9, the Son of Man, and there's themes that connect that to Isaiah 53. And he says that basically it's just as likely that there were Jews of antiquity that were reading the scriptures, like trying to find mysteries and connect these different verses for like deeper understandings of their redemption in the Messiah. And so I don't think that it's necessary that there was a charismatic a charismatic preacher, apocalyptic preacher, Jesus, to have to be crucified for them to go search the scriptures. I feel like they were searching the scriptures beforehand. That was like the mystical tradition of Midrash that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Pesharim, I mean,
Yeah.
the Midrashic, the allegorical. I mean,
And the connecting of different verses is the key for like greater understanding. And then also mixing that with like rewriting of stories. Like you would agree, like the prophecies of Jesus, like writing in. I mean, when you read the New Testament, it says, and then this, so the scripture could be fulfilled. And then to fulfill, so the prophet that said this, like the whole thing is following a narrative of like fulfilling the prophecies.
but how much of that was written after the fact and wasn't historical fact? I mean, the problem is a lot of that was written in after the fact, after the destruction of the temple, after all this stuff. It's rewriting of history. It's not writing history. That's where we get into the textual criticism and understanding that, decades and centuries later, depending on which part of the New Testament you're talking about, was written by people who had a narrative they wanted to tell.
So do you think Paul was before the destruction of the temple, though, right?
The literature we have of Paul is second century. Was there a Paul that lived before the second temple?
It seems like there's something the Gospels were based on, like they were aware of Paul.
I would even go into the pseudo-Clementine or the Clementine literature and say that whether it was Simon Magus or Paul, there was a character. But the New Testament writings of Paul we don't have them till the second century.
Right.
So was there a Paul in the first century? If he existed, he's not the one of the New Testament.
He wasn't aware. Well, from Paul's authentic letters, you can tell he wasn't aware of the temple's destruction. But the point I'm getting at is he says like he knows of Jesus, his gospel of Jesus is from the scriptures, right? He says at one point even like all he knew was that Christ was crucified and then resurrected after 3 days. What scriptures, like he doesn't cite his scriptures that this is fulfilling, but Daniel Boyarin and others think that he's talking about Daniel 7 and 9, that the Messiah is cut off, and then connecting that to Isaiah 53. And then that's like the story in Mark where Jesus is telling Peter, like, the Son of Man has to be rejected and suffer and die and resurrect. And he goes, no, don't do that. And he goes, get behind me, Satan. This is like, it's like this midrashic idea, this like mystical idea of connecting these two verses. It was new, and there was like division over it. And that became the conflict. Do we accept this original, like cosmic celestial high priest sacrifice suffering servant, or the political military Moshiach ben David? And that was like the whole Jesus Barabbas story, was them choosing the rebel, the military person, instead of the suffering Messiah. That's my understanding of it.
So I would connect the actual early followers of Jesus to the Zealot movement. And the reason that we lost a lot is because a majority of them were cut off before 70 AD because they were zealots, and I would place them as involved with that revolt. It's also why the remaining followers didn't follow when Bar Kokhba revolted, and they were made fun of. The Nazarene and Ebionites who did not participate in the Bar Kokhba revolt were shunned, because I think they had seen a failure before, and they had already kind of given up on that idea of fighting for Jewish national identity and their own land in Israel, whatever they would have called it at that time. But the Pesharim, the Midrashim, that it existed, but what was used to create the New Testament, I see as being done in Rome through a secular influence to influence an agenda towards Hellenism. And I want to place a majority of what comes into the New Testament and part and parcel becomes very central to the 4th century and beyond as original and germane. There may have been echoes of some of it used, but I would go back to what we have of the earliest text when it comes to and you can see this in some of the writings of Bart Ehrman and others, that our earliest writings don't have a record of resurrection, ascension, virgin birth, and even some of the elements of deification are not there, and that is later redaction. I don't see that as original to the early message.
I feel like the original layers that we have, like Paul, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, James, it's like it's more so describing like a heavenly figure. Like that's what we see. We don't have the biographical details of Jesus, like a preacher on earth in Paul. James is the brother of Jesus. Isn't it really weird that the epistle of James in the Bible doesn't introduce himself as Jesus or give any indication that he's the brother of Jesus? And then even Jude introduces his letter as the brother of James, but then you're going to mention you're the brother of James, but not the brother of Jesus. It just makes me think that, I have the understanding that when Paul first mentioned James as the brother of Jesus, he's just referring to him as a Christian brother, like all believers are brothers and sisters in Christ.
But that's kind of your modern understanding superimposing back then on it. I don't know.
No, Paul uses brothers and sisters all the time in that context.
No, I know, but we understand things from what we have, our life experience to like how we've seen Christianity and modern culture. Now, I see James and Jude as Catholicized documents, that they are what we have is not the original.
Well, didn't they know the story though? If they had Paul's letters, they should have known that was the brother of the Lord.
Who are you?
The Catholics, the proto-Orthodox Christians. It seems like that tradition of James being the brother didn't start until later. Otherwise, why would it not be in there?
Well, we have earlier documents that, if you look in the apostolic constitutions and some of the other literature, I mean, the tradition kind of goes back further. Now, but what I was saying is that like the books of James and Jude are documents that we have the Catholic version of, the redacted version, not the original. If you look at the secret epistle of James, or what's called the epistle of Peter to James and his reception, you're going to see a different type of James than, you're not going to see one that it's not the same as the epistle of James that's in the New Testament. And so the reason that those documents were chosen and put in the New Testament is because they supported their narrative, but I think they were redactions. And of course, there's just evidence that it wasn't written. If you look at some of the pseudo-Clementine literature, the works in the Apostolic Fathers and stuff like that, you're going to see a different James than is in the New Testament. Now, one, it might be a different person, but Peter and James are played heavily in this, and they are in conflict with their enemy, and the conflict between the two communities, which this plays out between the Ebionites and Nazarenes. So is there a historical Paul? Who exactly is he? Simon Magus, Paul, Simon who becomes Paul, the deceiver. Within the Talmudic tradition, if we get to Talmud Yeshu.
I was just going to bring that up. I've been waiting to bring that up with you because I saw you mention that. I did a whole video of rabbis from YouTube talking about total Yeshu. I think that's closer to the truth. That, and then what we see some in the Bible with a little bit of like, the understanding of the ascent of James, the proto James. I think when I look at all the info, total Yeshu basically says that Peter, and then some, I think Paul is even included, like separated Christianity as like a heretical threat to Judaism and wanted to move it away and almost make it, it's almost like they Hellenized it or made it more pagan to like keep Jews away from it. And that became like the spouter of lies. The Dead Sea Scrolls talks about Belial, how he has cast a net to like catch I see Christianity as like an inversion of Judaism, right? You agree with that? Paul basically inverted a lot of the law and stuff. So Christians are now consuming blood, not circumcising, not keeping kosher, all of these things that the Jews are supposed to do. So it kind of makes them, I see it 100%. Maybe at first it started as just like a cosmic spiritual victory savior, but then I think it quickly evolved into a religion that was for the Gentiles. I don't see this as, because it didn't even work. like the purpose of the Messiah in Second Temple Judaism was basically to theologically conquer the nations, the pagan idol worshiping nations. That's what they wanted. But they didn't do that with a military Messiah. They did it with the suffering Messiah that was rejected according to the scriptures and then goes to the Gentiles. And then that's the ultimate goal of Judaism, is have the nations worship the God of Israel. So in Maimonides says both Islam and Christianity are helping wean the world off paganism and bring the world to the God of Israel.
So I think that is a bit of a misunderstanding and a little bit of a reach. So defining terms to kind of clarify what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the main goal of the Zealots would have been national identity, national sovereignty, and independence for Jewish people. Now, when it says the nations will come to learn of, the God of Torah, it's because they did such a great job and identity. Now, it wasn't in the essence of global conquest to control all nations, but that they would want to learn about this God that gave the Jews their national identity. That is more what the thought was, less they would control the rest of the world. And I'm going to back that up in a little bit with some things. But I want to say there have always been essentially three branches of Judaism. There's been a secular nature, the Hellenization. There have been the more conservative, the Jews who want to, follow Torah, but, be decent people. And then there's the extreme, which at the time would have been the Essenes. Nowadays, you have the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidic Jews. And throughout history, there's always been, and the outliers are always the extremes of the secularization and the extreme of the Zealots. And the Essenes, and I would say a lot of the early Jesus movement were of the Zealot branch, and Paul was definitely an adherent of the Hellenistic branch. Now, Jews historically, and continue to be even after all that, unconcerned with converting Gentiles, and they believe the righteous of all people have a place in the world to come. So the Messiah to establish national identity for Israel was to establish Israel's independence, and then the idea that the the non-Jews would come to Israel to learn of the Messiah was in no way an indication that they wanted that to control other nations, but that people would want to learn about this Messiah that gave them their independence is more what the idea was. Now, the ideas that come to us through Christianity, through government control and suppression, come from Roman Catholicism, and there's a history of Rome using the ideas that they blended, and it wasn't just Christianity. Catholic means universal. It was Mithraism, Platonianism, Pythagoreanism. Roman Catholicism, it was co-opting other cultures, but so that you could brainwash, indoctrinate, and control them. There are echoes of this Midrashic Jewish tradition. There are echoes of these other things, but it's not true to the Enochian Judaism. What they took and became part of Christianity is not true to what was Enochian Judaism, isn't true to what was Essene Judaism, and what became Christianity and was used to take over the Western world was an aberrant version of the Hellenistic Judaism that was, in essence, mystical. But the core value system of the Jewish people was national identity, national sovereignty. Now, the idea that Messiah would establish that and they would worship the God of Israel in no way would supplant the national identity of other nations, or that would lead to them controlling or influencing other nations. And that's a misunderstanding of what that they would learn of Messiah.
Well, all he said is that they're going to believe in the Messiah. The world, that's the goal, is for the nations to recognize the one true God of Israel through his Messiah. That's like, you go look at all the Old Testament scriptures. That's what the role, clear as day, described. To go to the nations, the light, the servant, the light unto the nations. They will put their hope in him.
The primary goal would be national identity, national sovereignty, and out of that, the people.
What about Daniel 9, the Son of Man? from Daniel. Shoot, where is it? Daniel 7:27. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the most. Oh, I'm sorry. Daniel 7:13-14 is what I meant. The Son of Man coming out of the clouds of heaven. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worship him. Like, that's what I'm talking about right there. Something like that. All of the world worshiping him. Daniel 7:14.
So the focus of Judaism has been the Torah, the first 5 books. The Nevi'im and the Ketuvim is not the core of Judaism, and there's many interpretations of what that may be, but that's not the core focus of Judaism.
The prophet Daniel, and isn't that in Tanakh, right? That's Judaism. Doesn't Judaism today acknowledges Daniel?
Okay, it's not the Chumash, the first 5 books. It is in the Tanakh, but the focus of Judaism is the first 5 books.
Hold on, what is the word for the first 5 books? How come you don't call
Chumash.
it Torah? You say Chumash instead of Torah?
That just means 5, you know. So the Torah or Tanakh, or in Christian circles, Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books. So the Chumash is the first 5 books. The first 5 books are the core of what Judaism is. The writings are a bit of history, and the prophetic is definitely, it's not the core focus of Judaism is the first 5 books. There is a lot of interpretation. There's a lot like the focus hasn't and is not on books like Daniel. Is it in the Tanakh? Yes.
The Son of Man character is both in Enoch and in the New Testament as well.
And that's apocryphal literature that wasn't, accepted within the rabbinical tradition.
It was found in Qumran though, and Jude cites Enoch as well.
Again, it fell outside of like the mainstream of Judaism. You have outlying groups like we're talking about the Enochian Judaism and the Essenes. Those are outliers. They are not the large core. They're 2 groups on the outside, the fringes. Yes, there are those.
Who would be the hardcore then? The Pharisees, Hillel and Shammai, and then the Sadducees? That's mainstream?
The Sadducees would have been within the Hellenistic tradition, but the Pharisees, Hillel and Shammai, would be within mainstream, which became Rabbinic Judaism, which eschews all of those ideas.
But did adopt a lot of Essene ideas that later came into Kabbalah.
So Kabbalah isn't Rabbinic Judaism, but it's an offshoot of. So yes, it came from the tradition, but then they pull from that mystical tradition, say, like Essene influence and stuff like that. Now,
Merkava mysticism.
But that's still not the mainstream large core. Again, that's external. Not external. But
don't you think it's like kind of like
outliers.
It's reasonable to think like Paul was describing a mystical experience. He's caught up into the 3rd heaven. He's talking about revelations and visions and seeing Jesus in Scripture. So if that's why that's his argument, right? I learned it from no man. And so if that's what gives him authority, like, don't you think like that's just what the earlier Christians could have been doing too? And that this particular Jesus logo, suffering Messiah, Son of Man figure was first seen in the Scriptures by like James and Peter and John and some like Essene, maybe Ebionite sect.
Like, I wanted
to ask you, because you know a lot about this. What are the strongest arguments that Jesus was the brother of James? Like early people talking about Ebionites, I know they say that they didn't believe that he was, or they believed he was born of Joseph, right? That's what they would say. But did they conclude that just because they didn't have immaculate conception or something? I don't know. What do you think?
So the secret infancy gospel talks about, there's not just out in the Kelsis and Talmudic traditions. There's more than that points to Joseph being the father of Jesus, or potentially Pantera, a Roman soldier, which may have been a Jewish person serving in the Roman army, which Pantera was a common name in the Talmud used for people who served in the Roman army.
Do you think that
Which
myth is what led to the Armilus story?
the Armulus story? Which one?
Armilus, they say, is there's like a statue of him. He's born. It's mimicked off of Romulus, and I think it has something about a Roman soldier father as well.
I'm not familiar where they pulled that from, but I mean, but the early tradition of things outside of the New Testament, there are echoes, even early text of the New Testament that refer to the father of Jesus being Joseph. Later on they removed it and focused on Mary, the mother of Jesus. I mean, he had an earthly father. I mean, he wasn't God or divine. He wasn't savior of mankind. So, I mean, how else do you explain a human that was born? He had a father. There's no immaculate conception.
So let me ask you something. If it was Paul didn't create Christianity, so he didn't come up with the psyop. It was James and the Christian sects before him, right? That they must have been the real followers of Jesus. They were the ones that after he died, they were coping. They searched the scriptures to try to prove, like midrashically, oh, look at all the messianic proof here. The Messiah is meant to suffer. And then he came in, and really his biggest innovation that we know of is he just took it, expanded it to the Gentiles.
Definitely not. James and them were not involved with it at all. All of that.
Oh, really?
And it wasn't Paul. I mean, Paul's literature. Let's go to the tradition we have first.
So you're saying Paul, that they didn't think that his suffering was any atonement or anything? That was all 100% Paul?
They did not know. No, they didn't. There is evidence, and there are authors who believe this and have written this, that no, the early Ebionites did not believe he was Savior, didn't believe he was raised from the dead. And so that tradition was added later. Now, I don't believe Paul, there's some early inclinations of it, but it was developed over time. So Paul's early writings lightly played it, and then over time it was embellished. No, I see within James and Peter, Torah observant Jews who believed in conversion to Judaism, kept kosher and observed the festivals. And now I want to talk about something that you brought up earlier. Okay, so Judaism has always been about the study of text and the argument of text, and the main focus has been the Chumash, which is what the Talmud is. The recitation of the oral commentary about the first 5 books is the main focus. And so when we're talking about all this stuff that's outside of the first 5 books, we're talking about the prophetic literature, we're talking about the Apocrypha, we are talking about things that are outside of. Now, when you look at the Epistle of Peter to James, they talk about the tradition transmitted from Moses, the initiation and the study of the sacred text, and they followed the tradition of studying those first 5 books and debating those first 5 books, because that is what the core of Jewish tradition was for rabbinic Jews and for what I see in the early Ebionites. Now, the midrashic stuff that you're talking about, the stuff that influences Paul, but...
So you're saying that the original Christians only followed the Torah?
I wouldn't call them Christians, though.
Okay, the original Jewish Christians. The original...
Jewish followers of Jesus and James, and I don't know if Jesus was... He was a prophet.
Were they actually the followers of Jesus, or was James the guy? Because James seems like he had it.
Yeah,
James seems like he had it going on himself.
They were more followers of James. But here's the thing: the winners write history, and so a lot of their documents at 70 and 133 are destroyed, and then the focus for those who had the power to censor and distribute was in Rome. Now, Paul, I would say, had a light, there was Merkaba mysticism, there was Hellenism, Platonianism in his writings. And then you have, so the text that I think Marcion redacted, I'm inclined between written and redacted, but I think there was probably he's basing it off of Simon Magus or something. There's these epistles, these writings, and when he found them, he's known to have redacted what he had. He has his redacted gospel. So I believe he redacted the epistles he found, and so he added his own flavor to it. Now, when he was considered a heretic and the proto-Orthodox,
So hold on. Before this, were there Pauline sects before
he was very much in
Marcion?
disfavor, and he wasn't Paul. One, if you want to get into who I think Paul was, it's a little more interesting, but I definitely follow Celsus and Teldot Yeshu and the Ebionites who thought, okay, here, who was Paul? Paul
They
was,
thought he was a convert.
he was a convert who wanted to marry the high priest's daughter, and then because he was rejected, created his own thing that was separate. Now, he didn't create something new because he just took the stuff that was there and repackaged it. And over time, so he repackaged it, one, then Marcion repackaged it, and then the Proto-Orthodox repackaged it, and then the Catholics came in and just revamped the whole thing, and that's what we have in our textual tradition that starts in the 4th century, because the first complete Gospels that we have come post-Nicene.
So do you believe, like, are you Torah only too, or do you believe that, like, there's prophecies that a Messiah is going to come?
So as a secular Jew, I would put the idea of Messiah in a enlightenment of the world, where mankind comes to a better place and seeks peace, and Tikkun Olam wants to repair the world, versus a physical Messiah to establish a kingdom in Israel.
What is the role? What do you think the direction Christianity and Islam and all the other religions need to take to do Tikkun Olam and heal the world? Do you think it's Noahide? Do you think Noahidism is going to grow, and that's the solution?
I mean, I don't think it's a solution. I mean, it's Noahidism is if somebody likes the ideas of Torah but doesn't want to convert, so Noahidism, that's a modern term. In biblical times, you have Ger Toshav, Ger Tzedek. Ger Toshav was for Gentiles who lived in the land, and
is that God-fearers? Is that what you're saying with that term?
Ger Tzedek,
righteous Gentile
is God-fearers. Yes,
God-fearers, right?
Ger Tzedek is what would be the God-fearers.
It's like they had these God-fearers, and then they had kind of the ideas of Noahide laws for the nations. But I feel like it's like their prophecies foretold that all of the nations would come to the God of Israel, but they didn't want everybody to convert, because it's like, the nation of priests are different. So I feel like that's why Paul was opening up Torah messianism, like, to the nations. I think that's the role that he saw himself doing.
Now, Noahide does not just include Christian and Islam. It can include Hindus and Buddhists and any righteous Gentile. And no, Noahidism isn't a way to bring Gentiles to the God of Israel.
It says no idol worship, though. Like, Paul says that you cannot consume the food sacrificed to idols. Like, Hinduism would not be Noahide. The 7 Noahide laws is no idol worship.
But yeah, well, Paul isn't writing about Noahidism. Noahidism is a term for something found within rabbinic literature.
But he does speak against, like, idols. He says that the Gentiles' gods are basically demons. It's the same idea.
I mean, Paul's ideas I would not classify Paul's ideas as the same as
something else. Ebionites believed that, in, like, the Gnostic idea, that the devil or Satan was in control of this world, and so did Paul.
So that was a branch of the Ebionites, not all Ebionites. Oh. So there was, I'd say, 2 splits within the Ebionites. There's kind of what you would call the core, more historic Ebionites. And then there was a Gnostic group that rose in what it seems like the 3rd and 4th century. And you'll find a record of their writings in the Didache. And that comes from the offshoot that split with the original Ebionite group, and they are more Gnostic. And they were also influenced by Paul, and to some degree they accepted some of Paul's ideas. But, for the core of the Ebionites, they rejected Paul as a heretic. So the Gnostic, you don't see the Gnostic influence into Ebionite text, or what we, from study and research and what people looking back would call Ebionite text. we don't see that Gnostic until the influence really maybe late third century, but really fourth and fifth century. So you wouldn't go back to the first and second century. So that was a later development within the Ebionite tradition.
Like the Apocalypse of James is a Nag Hammadi Gnostic text.
Yeah, those are not first, second century.
But listen to what it says. This is interesting too. The text is written in the form of a dialogue between Jesus and James the Just. It contains secret teachings and revelations given by Jesus to James. These revelations often deal with esoteric and Gnostic themes. So there's another idea, another example of a book, early tradition, that James and Jesus had some type of like special spiritual connection. Like, yes. Like maybe in the ascent, the ascent of James that Epiphanius writes about, we don't have it; it's lost. But what if that was just like similar to the ascension of Isaiah, and it's this cosmic ascending Jesus, like in Hebrews?
Well, we can't assume what it is without the text in front of us. Mm-hmm. But again, those texts, the Gnostic branch of Ebionites was a later development.
You don't think that Gnostic thought came before Christianity? I believe it did.
There's a lot of things that played into the development of Christianity. All of the seedbeds were there. Mm-hmm. So was there thoughts before Gnosticism was defined as Gnosticism? Were there Gnostic thoughts? Yes. And again, I would still put that in the tradition that came from the Hellenistic Egyptian, and then as it came, Greco-Roman culture, and it kind of, it was influenced by, the Platonic ideas. Pythagoras.
Yeah, Philo blending Logos with Zechariah, the Joshua and Zechariah.
Yeah, so all of those seed beds, and Paul tapped into very well a bunch of aberrant ideas. He didn't invent something. He just took a lot of ideas and he compiled them in a way that was very appealing to the Roman elite of the time. And it's why the center went, because the James's group stayed in Jerusalem and then moved to Pella, but why the center of focus for what became Christianity was Rome, and it was nowhere near where the Ebionites, I would not place them in Rome. But Pauline Christianity, did Paul create Christianity? No, Paul's writings, and then I would say Marcion and the Proto-Orthodox gave birth to what became Christianity. I would not say Paul created Christianity. I would just put him in the vein of Hellenistic Judaism in the line of Philo and Josephus. But the seedbed for what was brought together into what became Christianity was many things.
It's like a lot of people talk about the diversity of early Christianity. There was all these different competing ideas, like Logos, Son of Man, Primal Adam, wisdom, all of these different ideas. And I think it shows that it didn't start at a centralized source and branch out, but it was like a diversity of a bunch of memes and competing sects that kind of had overlap. And I think that right away in 2 John, it says that the early skeptics of Christianity, some of them even Christian, were calling Christianity and Jesus a, quote, cleverly devised myth. And they were saying, like, you're an antichrist if you don't believe Jesus has come in the flesh. Like, that means that gives away that, like, early Christians were denying that he had come in the flesh. Maybe they were Docetists. Maybe they were, Ascension of Isaiahist. Maybe it started as a cosmic, spiritual, like, symbolic, Gnostic Christ type of savior. That I find that the more likely explanation.
So I would say that, okay, the diversity of early Christianity, one, yes, there is evidence for that.
The main point is, it's weird. Sorry to interrupt. It's weird that, like, if there was a historical Jesus and he was crucified and then it led to this following, that, oh man, I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, I kind of lost my.
I know. Sorry.
Yeah.
It'll come back to me in just a second too. I'm sure it always does.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I was gonna say.
Go ahead.
if he really did die and then that led to the following, it's unlikely that like right away all these competing heretical sects would pop up denying that he came in the flesh, right? That seems unlikely unless that's how it started. Seems like the more historical evolution of it.
No, actually, so here, trace history, and there are for 4 to 5 centuries, 100-year periods or centuries. You have polemics against Ebionites, Nazarenes, some other Jewish Christian sects. The primary polemics of over centuries was against these Jewish Christians. And that's by the Proto-Orthodox and the Catholic, meaning their primary adversaries were what we call the Jewish Christians, the Ebionites, and Nazarenes. Their primary, okay, so I'm going to talk about the two sects first, the main two split. What became Christianity? If you track over centuries, they are primarily polemically against Jewish Christians, which means they were a problem for centuries. Now, as location, and we trace it, the location historically, there was a group in Jerusalem. That group from Jerusalem went to Pella, and then it may have ended up in Antioch. So the Jewish Christians would have been situated within there. And now, actually, the different groups were very regional. The Gnostics were more in Egypt. The Pauline were in Rome, and then in Antioch were more Jewish Christian. Of course, and there was a group of Marcionites that rose in Antioch. And then, of course, you go back to Jerusalem. The first 12 leaders of that group were all of the circumcision. So I would say primarily.
Hold on, say that again. That was in your blog. I thought, in fact, your blog said, Eusebius said the first 15 of the popes of Rome were of the circumcision.
Yes. And my brain, sometimes I have dyslexia and numbers get flipped in my head. So,
well, I read that from your blog. I've been thinking about it a lot. It's that also makes me think that like this isn't a Roman conspiracy. If it's all for that long, it was all led by people of the circumcision.
No,
and also hold on, I just got to say the idea that the Romans created Christianity as a psyop to like subdue the messianic rebels. It doesn't make sense to me because it didn't really work. First of all, only a small remnant of Jews ever believed in Jesus, but it did get adopted widespread by the Romans. So I don't see the Romans creating a religion that would supplant their religion with the people they just conquered and like fulfill the prophecy of the Hebrews, to have their Messiah be the king of the world. I think because you'd have to admit it like backfired. It turned out like if Maimonides is saying that Christianity is like bringing the world closer to the God of Israel and away from paganism, like that was the prophecies to begin with.
Well, one, that statement is an oversimplification of a complicated century-wide process. And therefore, if you say it the way that like Caesar's Messiah says it, you're going to fail. If you say it was a Roman psyop and they invented it completely part and parcel, and then Josephus wrote the 4 Gospels,
That's what Atwill says. Yeah.
Yes, you're going to totally fail completely because that.
Are you more of the like James Valiant creating Christ?
I'm very nuanced, and when I say it, don't try not to look it through those lenses. Those are pre-existing works. They have some decent ideas. They're on to something, but the way that they phrase it, one is unfortunate because they're oversimplifying something that was a centuries-wide process. It was not, Vespasian was not the originator of Christianity. And this is why I'm trying to track through kind of our conversation here, why I would take it all the way back to Ptolemy. And, it wasn't a complete invention. Again, the way that the Roman, yes, in some ways, nuanced, very nuanced, similar to Valiant's work, but very nuanced. they would co-opt a culture, and they would change it to influence it towards Roman imperial ideas. No, I would not say that the Romans completely invented the New Testament. No, they didn't. They didn't invent the writings of Paul or the ideas of an oral tradition that became a gospel, but they did influence the textual tradition, the transmission, and through layers of redaction. I could take you through the periods of redaction. They started with a pro-Roman influence, and then with the Marcionite layer, and I talked to Dr. Price about this as well. He agrees that with the Marcionite layer, it castrated itself in a lot of ways from Torah Judaism, but then the Proto-Orthodox tried to bring back in elements of Torah Judaism, but it was still Hellenistic Judaism. It wasn't true Torah Judaism. And then the Catholic Church, it was between the 4th and 8th century that there was a whole lot of governmental policies that they censored and destroyed text. They forced themselves to become the ruling narrative through imperial power. And it wasn't invented at one point, but there are stories that were particularly historic, germane to the what I would place Christianity from the Hellenistic Jewish tradition, the Merkaba mysticism. And there were elements there that they co-opted, blended with their myth and their traditions, but over time they influenced the message with they embedded language and terminology about the soul, heaven and hell, and salvation that makes people that was not germane to what I would call Torah Judaism of the time, but makes people very susceptible to control. The idea of hell and eternal torment, the soteriology of Paul, I would not put those within the first century Judaism, or even what I thought Ebionites would think about that. Mm-hmm. But that soteriology of hell and torment and the fear of it, and so the process of confession, repentance, and salvation was something that the Roman government would do when they forced people to convert to paganism, and it predates Christianity. The conversion process of Christianity was something that they would do when they converted somebody to paganism. It is not the way that, even if you look within the Epistle of Peter to James, the textual tradition, studying for 6 years, circumcision, they did not follow what became Christianity's salvation. And there are records of the Roman tribunals where they're converting people to paganism, and they follow the same process because Hades and hell played big within their idea, which, they also, when Christian writers tried to co-opt the idea of Sheol and Gehenna, which is not the same as hell. It's a process of purification where somebody is able to access heaven after a period of time, where inverse, like Christianity, they're tortured for eternity. I mean, that's a fearful thing. And if I can tell you that you're going to hell and you need a savior, Messiah was never to be a savior. And national redemption, which the idea that was co-opted and turned into Christian salvation, was about national redemption, not personal salvation. Mm. And so the two messages and methods are different.
They're almost like an inversion. It's like an antithesis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say it was definitely contra Essene what Paul did, but he was in response to it.
But it also has a lot of parallels with Essene too. Like a lot of stuff in Christianity is not original or unique to it. You find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of themes.
Some of it, yes. Mm-hmm. But
let me ask you. You'll like this probably. Gospel of Peter. You've talked to John Dominic Crossan, or if you're not, I'm sure you read his books. I saw you list him on one of your bios there, I think. Mm. He did the book, The Cross That Spoke, right? Yeah. 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in that, he has the theory that the Gospel of Peter has the passion narrative that actually predates the canonical Gospels. Are you familiar with that theory?
I mean, I've heard it. Mm-hmm. I definitely don't subscribe.
Because it's interesting because that starts with Herod crucifying Jesus on a tree, it says, by the way, too. And then, in later on, or later on, if Crossan is right, in the canonical Gospels, it has, Pilate washing his hands. But, it's not Herod doing it. It's still the Romans doing it. I was just wondering if you had a theory on that.
On Pilate, not the Romans? Wait.
Yeah, Gospel of Peter is very similar to the Passion narrative in the Gospels, but it has Herod killing Jesus, not the Romans. Herod's men. So it's weird. It's like if that was the original story, and then later they added in that the Romans that did it.
See, I didn't, okay, yes, we have that, but there's not enough there to say that's the original. I mean...
Well, I was just curious that's why I was asking, because I just watched a video from Crossan. He makes a couple of arguments why he thinks that.
I mean, I'm familiar with the text. I've read the text. I know what the text says. There's not enough for me to place that actually in the first century, which I find problematic. It's definitely more of Gnostic tradition, which I see Gnosticism rising more second, third century, especially when it relates to Christian origins. Not Gnosticism in general, but Gnosticism as it becomes part of Christianity, second, third century, as it influenced the Ebionites, third and fourth century. But I have very hard time placing some of those.
The other thing that makes me think that, I learned this from Nailed, David Fitzgerald's book. He talks about how like the Jesus's trial contradicts between it's probably Matthew and Luke, and that it gets clunky, and like they go back to Pilate and go back to the Romans and go back to the high priest, and he thinks that that's because there was an earlier version, and then there was two different versions that got combined together.
I mean, yes, there are definitely the traditions in the New Testament, and I mean, historically piecing together what happened is a little challenging there.
Well, because the idea is that the other idea is that like the Romans came up with Gospel of Peter after to try to exonerate the Romans from killing Jesus.
Yes, I have heard that, and
Here's a question too. This is another good one. So the Apostolic Creed and the Nicene Creed, they both don't say anything about the Jews killing Jesus. They blame Pontius Pilate only. So if it was a Roman conspiracy, why would they be blaming themselves and exonerating the Jews in those creeds?
So the creeds predate, and some of it is Catholicized a little bit. The creeds predate the full Catholicization. Now, I'm saying it's a process, okay? So you can't say it was one and done, and we put it in a certain place and time. We put the tack on the wall, and that's it. No, it was a process. Now, how does that, and we got to square it with history now. Okay, yeah, we have the Apostolic Creed, and it puts it on Pontius Pilate. Then how does the Catholic Church, for all of its history, early, on and into the Middle Ages,
blame the Jews?
Blame the Jews for deicide, which they used justification in the Crusades and for various pogroms and inquisitions where they're killing Jews. So hold on, you're going back to something that echoes an original, and then you're making claims about what became Christianity and Catholicism. The two are entities that developed over time. So is the Apostolic Creed comes from a tradition that predates them. So are there echoes of something different that predated them? Yes. But, you have to look at this thing in centuries and then look what it became by the 8th to 12th century. And when you're talking about Christianity as we experience it in pop culture and in today as something that has won the Western world and influences thought around, Western Europe and America, you have to look at what happened in the 8th to 12th century, because the Christianity we know today, and then it even, get into the Reformation, comes out of all that. Now, we're confounding two things, like Christian origins, and then when we say the term Christianity, what is it today as it influences us, and how did it become that? And that we're talking centuries, and not a one and done thing. So,
well, it's not even a one and done thing today. There's a lot of diversity.
Oh, it's one of the most diverse religions in the world. It has more sects than any other religion on the planet. So it's still very diverse.
So, but the idea is, this is what we hear, like, that they say, okay, Jesus was a real person. He was crucified by the Romans. Like, that's all we know about him. That's like, what Bart Ehrman and kind of the consensus view in scholarship, right?
Yeah.
They say Jesus was a Jewish apocalyptic preacher. He was baptized and crucified by the Romans.
Yeah, and that's all we can really, take to the bank. The rest is...
Well, I don't even think you can take
Doing
that.
our
But
best.
so then later on, it's the idea is that the Romans tried to like look for prophecies to blame the Jews instead. Like, how did that come in if that's not what historically happened? How did the Jews start being blamed? And who did that? Who was like reading the scriptures and like decide? I don't think any of it happened. I don't think Barabbas happened. I think it's just they saw the scriptures that he would be rejected by men in Isaiah 53 and other. He would be cut off. Wisdom of Solomon says that we'll put the man put him to a shameful death. So I think that's where they got the idea that they would reject him. And they cite Psalms. He's the stumbling stone that becomes the cornerstone. Like all of this midrashic, like prophetic argumentation.
I mean, again, I would agree with a lot of that. It happened over time. They were looking for a way to tell the narrative they wanted to tell. And, but it was a process. They didn't do it all at once. And as elements came together later on, this midrashic thing where they would search for Jesus in the text, ways to blame the Jews for their own destruction. Blaming the victim for the victor's conquest is a wild thing to do. To blame, the Jewish people for the conquest of the Roman people and the eradication of, their statehood and text and tradition and trying to rewrite history. But that's what the winner does to any kind of history. The winner gets to write history, and there goes the spoils of war. It was a process over time, and you can see it as it progresses. When you start looking at the theology of the early church fathers as it develops, you can see where, binitarianism comes in, that eventually leads to modalism, that eventually leads to Trinitarianism. Trinitarianism wasn't a first century idea. So all of these ideas that were co-opted, the midrashic things that they co-opted from various Jewish groups, and they were eclectics. Catholic means universalist. They were eclectic. They were taking elements from this, that, and the other to paint the story they wanted. And as time progressed, they developed these ideas. So when I say it was a Roman psyop, I would really have to correct myself now because, really a Greco-Roman because of the way that I date it and everything. But it was a process over time that they took the message and they subtle changes, little pieces here and there that eventually amalgamated into the received text that, we don't have till the 4th to 8th century, and we even have changes up to the 12th century. So, we between, 400 and 1200, we have an evolving tradition. And then, you have the Reformation, which is now like, oh, we need to reinvent it because they screwed it up, but they never fully got rid of the faulty foundation. They keep the foundation and continue to revamp and build upon that. There's not a specific place in time that I would say they did. It was just over time. It was a convenient co-opting of myth and then the redaction, editing, changing, and distribution because it was gaining popularity. And as it was popular, they saw an opportunity. And if you have the power to, produce, distribute, edit, and redact, they also had the power to destroy anything that competed with. And so when I talk about it was the government was involved over centuries.
That's a really long, continuous conspiracy with like a lot of competing dynasties and stuff.
Now, there is a blog post where I kind of talk about that. It is, and it wasn't a one and done, but I think it was part of their ongoing goals of conquest, which they have successfully done. The Roman Empire, took over a lot of the world. Now, of course, the Roman Empire went into disfavor, but Catholicism keeps a lot of their influence in much of the world, and then by extension, Protestantism and the Reformation and even evangelicals continue a lot of those ideas, which still present idea
If
persuasion.
Christianity spread across the world, basically theologically conquered the world with the power of the Roman Empire, and then today scholars are saying that Jesus was an anti-Roman Jew that was killed by the Jews, and the Jews had nothing to do with it, and that Jesus didn't really fulfill all these prophecies. Where is that going to leave Christianity for the future? What is your... How do you see Christianity in the future, and what do you suggest Christians do? Follow in your path, become convert to Judaism?
No. Find peace with the world as they see. No, definitely not. As we go back to saying, righteous of all people, a place in the world to come. No, you don't need to become a Jew. That's a personal choice. And what the answer for Christianity is a question Christianity has to wrestle with themselves. That's not.
Well, you talked about Tikkun Olam. Do you think Tikkun Olam is possible while Christianity is believing in, falling for like a Roman psyop? Doesn't that need to be, Christianity need to be exposed before the world could ever heal?
No. The Christianity doesn't have to be exposed. So what does Tikkun Olam, repair the world?
Reformed?
Tikkun Olam means, to repair the world because, with the fall of Adam, the world is broken. It's doing good deeds and kindness in the world, and people can do that without Judaism and without information from Judaism. Judaism is not required for a person to choose ethics and choose to do good and moral things in the world. No, Judaism is not required for Gentiles. The Torah observance is not required for Gentiles. Choosing to be a Noahide is not required for Gentiles. The Torah is for Jews. It is not for Gentiles. Mm-hmm. And so, no, Judaism doesn't have a goal for the world to become Noahides. And Christianity has to grapple with its own history, and let's see if I can answer your question, because it's definitely not a goal of mine as somebody who's left Christianity. I share my experience to help those who are on a journey out on their own, whether it's to atheism, agnosticism, secularism, any other religion of their choice. My goal isn't to convert people to Judaism, because that's a personal life choice, and it isn't for people to become Noahides. That's in no way what I seek to do, and I don't. As far as Judaism, that's not a goal for it. Mm-hmm. As far as Christianity, how does it come to terms with itself? Well, I mean, first we got to deal with the historical record. We have to deal with the textual record, and with textual, we got to figure out these original texts, but we don't have an original text, so there's no solid foundation to build anything on, but you can do your best to find the most historical, which scholars debate on. Mm. Now, historical, Christianity has to deal with, there's so many layers of...
Repenting?
No. There's so many layers of stuff that just is not historical, and was government involvement, Roman involvement, but became a religion. There was part of religion, co-opted religion. Just dealing with the history of, violence. Constantine's sword. If I don't know if you read that book, but talking about the history of violence. So
should I? And I have not. Is that a good one?
It is. It's a really Constantine's sword. There's a documentary based off of it. I would recommend. It talks about the history of violence in the name of the cross since Constantine, and how it's shaped the world, and even continues to shape the world through the Jesuits and those in America who advocate for war and constant war.
I was just going to ask you about that, and I want to keep it to an hour and a half. So can I get a final question in for you? What do you think about the evangelical Christians in America, the fundamentalists, the ones that worship Trump like he's the savior, and they want to destroy the Dome of the Rock, rebuild the temple, so Jesus will come back on a cloud? What are your thoughts on them?
Stay out of Jewish politics in the Middle East, and don't create trouble for us, please. Let's keep Israel and choices in Israel to Jewish people, not to the financial interest of messianists who want Islam to try to destroy Israel so their Messiah can reveal himself. I would rather them not be involved in politics when it comes to Israel, but they may live their life in America as they choose, but let's not superimpose your
When you say the
Christian views.
Muslims destroy Israel so the apocalypse can come, are you referring to like Armageddon, Gog and Magog?
Yeah, so yeah, the evangelical idea that's shared by, messianics and others, that most of the Islamic nations are going to attack Israel so that their Messiah will come. And Islam has the same idea that there's going to be a fight with the Jews, that their Messiah is going to come.
Which they think is Jesus. They think Jesus is returning.
Both groups do, which is interesting that they have the same Messiah in conflict with each other. But I don't subscribe to any of that kind of messianism, and I see it as a danger in the world because anyone who adheres to that tends towards violent ideologies, and their focus on influencing financially the support of war and stuff like that is towards cataclysmic wars that we do not need and is not helpful. And I don't believe, if you're going to ask me, the age of Messiah is going to be led by a military victory. Like I said before, I think it's an ideological shift towards peace that we all find a way to get along, and that's where Gan Eden is. It's not in the violent conquest of mankind.
All right, we can close it out there. Hour and a half. Jeremiah, I'm finally glad that I got to talk to you. As soon as I saw your channel, I was like, oh, I want to talk to this guy. I almost asked you like, I don't know, a year or so ago whenever you started it. But I'm enjoying hearing your insights on these things. We obviously have some disagreements on the big picture analysis, but definitely it's cool to pick your brain on your research on these similar topics. So I appreciate the time. And why don't you, for my audience, why don't you plug where people can find more of your work, your channel, your blog?
Well, thank you for having me on. Thank you for challenging me with your insights and, pressure test all things. So I don't have, I appreciate you challenge me on ideas that we definitely don't come to the same conclusions. In some ways we have opposite conclusions, but it was an interesting conversation. I appreciate, your thoroughness, asking insightful questions. And so I appreciate you. Thanks for bringing me on. And where can people, connect with me? The Pulling the Threads podcast is available everywhere that you listen to podcasts, on YouTube. And I also have a podcast, the Pulling the Thread podcast, at JesusTheJewWithinJudaism.com, where I discuss Jesus within Jewish tradition before and without the influences of Christianity, what it would be seen through the eyes of Jews. And
you see all these Christians online, they're like, these Christians are in denial. They want to say Jesus wasn't Jewish. They say Jesus was white. The Black Hebrew Israelites say Jesus was black. Everybody wants to be the chosen people. Everybody wants to have Jesus look like them, it seems like.
It does seem to be the case with the popularity of Christianity and its co-opting of the message of, it's an idea that's quite intriguing to a lot of people. But they should find what is good for them and relish in who they are, and seek peace in the world and try to be good people. I like to look at things through a historical perspective, so just try to look at things rationally and present arguments in a rational fashion. So, but I do thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
And
thanks for your work. Thanks for all your interviews and your guests and your blogs. It's it's been a great resource to educate myself as well and learn more.
All right.
All right.